Oh, okay. Yeah, that'll work. Sorry, I'm already late. If you would, turn in your Bibles to Leviticus 12. Leviticus 12. And so tonight is going to be kind of strange. I'll admit I'm not really sure how this is going to work. I've never taught 4 chapters in one day before. So, but we've come up through the book and we've gone through it chapter by chapter, and we've gone through all the different offerings, and then the way that the priests get ordained, and the installation of the priests, and the first worship service there in the temple. We looked at what happens when God is worshipped wrongly, and then we got into chapter 11, which is really all about determining what is clean or unclean, what is profane and what is holy. And these next several chapters are just more of that. Some people call it like this is the Bible's kind of cleanliness manual. And now we're going to deal with all these very specific situations that can seem, I just admit up front, they can seem strange as it goes over and over all the details of how to deal with these things. It can seem tedious. There's some sections in here that some people think are very offensive. There's definitely some in here that are gross. But again, we approach this because God is trying to teach us something, and all these things that God had Israel do are lessons that they lived out that was meant to impress upon God's people something. And so that's what, as we deal with this whole section, is on bodily discharges and pus and skin disease and blood and decay and mildew and childbirth. So as we look at these things, what are all these laws about blood and disease and discharges? What does this teach us as Christians about our need for Christ? So let's just jump in. So chapter 12, if you take a look at verse 1 there, and again, we're not going to read through all of these 4 chapters. I'm sorry. We're going to cherry pick them a little bit just to try to get the big idea. So chapter 12, verse 1, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, and then now it's going to give this very specific situation. When a woman gives birth and delivers a male child, then she shall be unclean for 7 days. As she is in the days of her menstruation, shall she be unclean. Then on the 8th day, the flesh of the foreskin shall be circumcised, and she shall stay at home in her condition of blood purification for 33 days. She shall not touch any consecrated thing, nor enter the sanctuary until the days for purification are completed. But if she gives birth to a female child, then she shall be unclean for 2 weeks, for 14 days, just like in her menstruation, and she shall stay at home in her condition of blood for purification for 66 days. Okay? And so I think this is worth kind of reminding too. Remember last week when we talked about clean and unclean, sometimes it's something sinful that makes you unclean, but there's also kind of a ritual cleanliness. There are things that ritual uncleanness is not sin, and that's this case. So we don't want to look at this and say, children in childbirth are sinful. Some days you may feel like their mere existence is sinful, but the Bible is just so clear that it celebrates children, it celebrates the marriage that produces children, it celebrates motherhood. Those things are good things. They're not sinful. This is a ritual uncleanness that's meant to point to something. And What I suspect it is, and what many Bible commentators believe is when you look down through these situations, it's, the Bible says that life is in the blood. So when you lose blood, it's this idea of kind of the loss of life. And everything about cleanness and uncleanness is celebrating life versus death. What God gives is life, and death is part of the curse. And so the woman here, because there's this loss of blood afterward, and it describes it that way as a blood purification. It compares it to menstruation, all that. And so the mother is ritually but not morally unclean. Again, because this symbolic loss of life, things aren't the way they're supposed to be. Birth wasn't designed to be painful. It wasn't designed to be a chore. It was meant to be this life-giving thing. And so all this kind of reminds us of the fall and reminds us that everything isn't what it should be. Everything isn't entirely as God commands. And then probably, if you pay attention to the numbers here, there's like a certain period of time for boys, and it's twice as long for girls. And then if you're a person that's sensitive to those differences, you're like, hey, wait a minute, this seems unfair. Why is it that girls are twice as long? Catch Pastor afterward and ask him all the questions you would like to ask. Maybe it's meant, I think maybe there's some kind of relationship here to, like boys get circumcised, and so that's the sign of the covenant, and that's supposed to happen on the 8th day. So I think that's tied in, but I really can't nail that down as, like why the specific numbers. But I think it's because the circumcision of the boy reminds us and represents that covenant between God and his people, that Abrahamic covenant, that God is going to send someone through the line of Abraham, and he's going to bless the line of Abraham and also bless the Gentiles and bless the whole world. So it's perhaps meant to give us to see a difference in that this one is pointing toward the hope of the covenant. I think that's probably true. I also think too, we're tempted to look at all this as punitive, but probably there's plenty of moms in this room that would say, after I had a child, I could shut up in the house and everybody leaves me alone, and I don't have to go anywhere, and I'm not responsible for anything for 40 days or 80 days. Sounds good to me. And so I do think there is kind of a humanitarian idea here that God is protecting and sheltering the woman and giving rest in this time. Even down in verse 6, then there's on the other side of this, there's this restoration of fellowship. And when the days of her purification are completed for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring the priest to the doorway of the tent of meeting, a 1-year-old lamb for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. And so this offering is probably because during the time of her pregnancy and during the time of her purification, she's not able to come to the temple. And so there's this idea that there is maybe sin offerings that she wasn't able to make for herself at that time, and so these come now. And it also reminds us in verse 8, if she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 young doves. And again, this is there is a barrier that God places before we approach him. We can't just we have to approach him by sacrifice. But God's purpose is never that barrier is financial. That like I can't afford this. God takes that problem away. That it's just the recognition that blood must be shed for sin. And that reminds us too, you remember in Luke 2 where Joseph and Mary come to the temple, and you remember what it says that they offer? Luke 2, 22, 24, says they come and what they offer is two birds, which kind of shows you where in the social status Joseph and Mary were. And so they were poor, but they were faithful to the law, and God made a way for them. So we see that. Flip over to Leviticus 15, just because I'm trying to group this together in the various discharges. And then we'll come back to chapters 13 and 14. Okay. Chapter 15 is going to give kind of 4 different categories of things that come out of you. And there is chronic male discharges and temporary male discharges, followed by temporary female discharges, followed by chronic female discharges. I can see the looks on all your faces of what a great topic this is. Chapter 15, verse 1. The Lord also spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when any man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. This, moreover, shall be his uncleanness in his discharge. It is his uncleanness." And many commentators think that the idea of this being kind of this chronic thing is perhaps the result of some kind of sexually transmitted disease. And then it goes on to explain, like, anything he touches becomes unclean. Anything he sits on becomes unclean. People that touch him become unclean. And then later they must bring some kind of offering. Verse 16. Now, if a man has a seminal emission, he shall bathe all of his body in water and become unclean until evening. As for any garment or any leather on which there is a seminal emission, it shall be washed with water and be unclean until evening. If a man sleeps with a woman so that there is a seminal emission, they shall both bathe in water and be unclean until the evening. You guys all know what I'm talking about here, right? Okay. So here, this is different than the passage we're talking about before. And so this is kind of, now we're going to be talking about like normal sexual activity between a husband and a wife. It's interesting in this case that the uncleanness just lasts until the evening, and there isn't any kind of sacrifice required. And so if this is normal sexual activity between a man and a woman, then why? Because relationships between a man and a woman are good. God designed that. These are supposed to be good things that bring life. So why does that make you unclean? There is the passage in 1 Corinthians 7 that talks about a husband and wife will abstain from one another, and why does it say to do that? So you could focus on prayer. So this activity between a husband and a wife in that context is very good. But also this idea that you realize that there are times to step away from that and focus on prayer and worship of God. I think maybe there's also an element here that this stigmatizes promiscuity. Like now of course you could hide it and you could not admit it and all that, of course. But the idea that there is this reminder that that there could be a place where this relationship is out of bounds, and it reminds you that then you're unclean and something has to be done. It goes on down in verse 25 and talks about the woman. Verse 25, now if a woman has a discharge of her blood for many days, not at the period of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond that period, for all the days of her impure discharge she shall continue as though in her menstrual impurity she is unclean. And again, there might be some of this that feels like this is kind of oppressive, and this is like, some of these are like natural bodily functions, and now I'm like unclean and I can't go to church. But I do also think, like, I think so oftentimes we understand that the law is difficult, and no one's saved by the law. The law is meant to remind us that we can't get to God based on our own purity, right? But because God is so gracious and so good that even in His law, there's always things that are, there are things that are good for us. It's wrong to lie, because that's an offense against God, but that's also just destructive in our life, right? And so I definitely think there's something here that's protective of women, especially in a day and age where, I knew it's going to be a weird night of things to talk about, but like in the day and age that we don't have all the products, ladies, that we have now that, allow you to move around. So it's much different in this time, right? So now, this can be viewed as a protective thing that kind of protects your dignity, and you don't have to worry about how you're going to appear or anything that you don't want to get stained publicly. Nate, help me out here, man. You're raising your hand. Rescue me. You're getting ahead of me? I'm glad you see the connection. Let's look at that. So in Matthew 9, in verses 20 and 22, we get this story of this woman with chronic bleeding, right? Anybody remember how long it was? 12 years. And so if you're unclean and you can't attend the temple, okay? So, just the physical condition is oppressive enough, right? And then you also think like the isolation that comes with it. And she's unclean, and everything she touches is unclean, and she can't go to temple. And now you realize that the desperation for this woman that approaches Christ was maybe far, far greater than even we realize. And all these, I think, still come back to this idea that through all these various discharges that come out of people, it's kind of like this concept of we're leaking out life. Okay, and so there's a ritual uncleanness there. Some of these are chronic, some of them are temporary, but the idea that life is cleanness and death is uncleanness. This loss of blood, this loss of fluid is the loss of life. And God is the God of life. He wants to give eternal life. He created people for life. He created a universe and an earth that teems with life. God Himself is just life-giving. And so you get down to the end of Leviticus 15. And you shall keep the sons of Israel separated from their uncleanness, so that they will not die in their uncleanness by their defiling my tabernacle that is among them. So even in this thing that's kind of this symbolic picture, God is serious that this picture would really teach them. Like there's this way of approaching the tabernacle, and all these other things we saw that were offerings and dealings with sin, and then gratitude offerings and peace offerings, and but it's hard not to walk away from this and just say, like, man, just my very existence, what oozes out of me constantly is my unfitness to be near the Holy of Holies. Everything about me, just not even when I'm thinking about like my big overt sins, but just my broken life, walking through this broken world, I am just unfit to be near God. I think that's the only thing that people would walk away from with this lesson. It's like, man, when I think of all these things and all these ways that I am unclean, I am basically just unclean. Flip back to Leviticus 13. And so we kind of had laws that deal with purification after childbirth. There's laws that deal with various bodily discharges. 13 and 14, kind of in the middle, is all about these laws dealing with disease and decay. And so the Hebrew word here for leprosy it isn't narrowly just as the very specific disease of leprosy. But it can refer to like all kinds of different skin conditions and chronic, but it can also even apply to like breakouts of things on clothing and in places, molds and mildews that can rot away leather garments and mildew your home. And so this passage deals with, you're going to see this pattern repeating of where it's, it tells us that the Lord spoke, and then it's going to finish up that section by saying, this is the law. So when you look at verse 1, then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, and then he goes on to talk about diseases in people and in clothing. And in verse 59 of chapter 13, this is the law for the mark of leprosy in a garment of wool or linen, whether it is in the warp or in the woof. I'm not someone that weaves fabric, so I'm not sure. One of those is one way and one of them is the other, and I'm not really sure which. But we don't need to know. Or in any article of leather, for pronouncing it clean or unclean. So let's deal with kind of people and clothes. And then when you go to chapter 14, again, you see this pattern again. Verse 1, then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, and it lays it all out. Look at verse 32. This is the law for him in whom there is an infection of leprosy, whose means are limited for his cleansing. And it's going to give this instructions for, all right, well, how do you be cleansed after you recover from whatever it is that they had? Later on in chapter 14, it deals with your home. Verse 33, then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, and then it finishes up in verse 54, this is the law for any spot of leprosy, even for a scale, and for the leprous garment or house, and for a swelling or for a scab, for a bright spot, to teach when they are unclean and when they are clean. This is the law of leprosy. And so there's things that happen in your house. And the priest in both these chapters functions almost not like a doctor. It doesn't say that he's doling out health advice. He's like a health inspector. And so it's his job to guard the purity of the community and to decide if this is serious enough, if this is a threat to people or not. And this is the passage that tells us when someone has some kind of condition and people approach them from a distance, what you're supposed to do is kind of self-quarantine and be like, hey, you, unclean, unclean, and you shout it out so that people know to avoid you and make a wide berth around you. And this kind of results in just kind of total isolation from the community. And there's torn clothes, and they cry out in this way. Chapter 13, verse 45. As for the leper who has the infection, his clothes shall be torn, the hair of his head shall be uncovered. He shall cover his mustache and cry out, unclean, unclean. And this feels harsh, but consider, like, what mechanism did they have to protect people and to protect the community? And so the priest inspects them and tries to bring health to the community of people. It's interesting that in the second half of chapter 14, when it's dealing with homes, there's no sacrifices to be made. Why? because houses don't have a relationship with God. You know, they're items that it's there to remind you that there's still uncleanness, but you don't have to make any kind of offering for your home. All these, I think, reminded the people that God exists in spotless, perfect perfection. He is holy and we are not. So the reminder here is God lives in snow white cleanliness. And anytime I walk near, I am dragging muddy boots, you know, and everywhere I go, I'm leaving a mess, whereas God is holy and pure. And then once you think of this kind of clean and unclean, this pure and impure, it does remind you of, think of the different, so think of this situation. You're unclean. You have to shout at people. You tear your clothes. You uncover your head. You cover your face. And so now when you see like, well, there's 10 lepers and Jesus heals them all, and only one of them comes back to express gratitude and how his life's changed. Like, it really makes that hit different, because it's like your life was so affected. And just imagine you're cut off from everybody. Your family and your friends and your faith community. And Jesus stepped into that situation and fixed it, and then they just walked on with their lives. Isn't that a crazy story? Like, how did that happen? So again, the woman who was hemorrhaging blood for 12 years. Just real quick, and we're going to kind of finish up as we think about kind of gospel fulfillment here. But turn to Mark 1. Turn to Mark chapter 1. We'll try to kind of finish up here quick here. I'm going long. Mark chapter 1, verse 40. And a man with leprosy came to Jesus, imploring him and kneeling down and saying to him, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Okay? So right off the bat, this man approaches Jesus, and he knows he can do it, which is staggering, because again, this is kind of life-ending for you, right? Just isolated and alone and cut off from the tabernacle. And in the case of this just life-altering, life-ending disease, like, Jesus, I know you can do it. The only question is, are you willing to? Do you? I know you can heal me, Jesus. I'm hoping that you want to. If you are willing, you can make me clean. Verse 41, moved with compassion, Jesus reached out with his hand and he touched him and he said to him, "I am willing, be clean, be cleansed." Verse 42, and immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed, and he sternly warned him and immediately sent him away. And he said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest." See, Jesus knows what the law is. He knows how this is supposed to work. Show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them. But he went out and he began to proclaim it freely and to spread the news around to such an extent that Jesus could no longer publicly enter a city, but stayed in the unpopulated areas, and they were coming to him from everywhere. I don't want to, this is a real event, so I don't want to allegorize it, right? But I really think here there is a wonderful picture in this interaction that we can see of salvation. Because first off, this man has to know that he's unclean. Okay? He has to know that he is outside the temple. He is far from the people of God. He is unclean. There is nothing that makes him commendable. There's nothing that draws him near. And if there's anything we avoid today, it's this idea that I am unclean. I can say that I'm not perfect. We all like to say, "Oh, no, I'm not perfect." Okay? But not perfect and I am filthy unclean are not the same thing. And we don't want to admit that we're filthy and we convince ourselves that we're not that bad. But this guy, just like the evidence is all over his body, so he knows he's unclean. And the other thing that this man knows is that Jesus can make him clean. And that's really the beautiful part of it. Faith is believing that Jesus can do what nobody else can do. Faith is believing that Jesus is the solution to a problem that's beyond you to even begin to comprehend it. And that Jesus can do what you, even yourself, can't do. And so, if you know that you're unclean, do you believe that Jesus can make you well? And to me, this is such a great, so imagine you're coming from Old Testament Israel, right? And this is just your life. All of these rules about cleanness and uncleanness, okay? And it's just ingrained into you that everything about you is far from God. Everything about you is unholy, whereas God is holy. Everything you do, just even in the course of the regular stuff of your day, you are unclean. And then on top of that, uncleanness is like a crazy rash that spreads. Everything you touch becomes unclean. Unclean people that touch you, you become unclean. You sit on the thing, it becomes unclean. And it's just, it's this, it's just like this fog that pushes out and touches everybody. That's your concept of life and life near God. Now then imagine how different everything about Jesus is. Okay? Because when Jesus comes near to something that's unclean, what happens? Does Jesus become unclean? Now Jesus is this force that moves out, and instead of everything like dominoes becoming unclean, everything that Jesus touches becomes clean. And so this even this woman, when Jesus doesn't know it, and she comes up and she touches him, he's like, who touched me? Like, just her nearness to him and this problem that she's had for 12 years becomes cleansed. This man who wants nothing else other than to be cleansed, Jesus touches him, and unlike all these other diseases and all these sins where the disease spreads, Jesus is like righteousness spreads. Jesus' righteousness overcomes our unrighteousness. And so verse 41, he's moved with compassion, and he's willing, and immediately the leprosy left. Jesus does not become unclean by touching us. We become clean by touching him. Like, if we don't get anything out of all this other than that, that's worth it. And so everything about the law kept the unclean at a distance to preserve God's holiness. Everything about Jesus always invites people to come near. He goes to the outskirts of town. He goes to the woman at the well at the time when no one else would be out there. He touches people that nobody else will touch. And all the things that make us gross and unclean and our sin and death and decay, he takes upon himself so that we can have access to the Holy of Holies, so we can approach God. And so I guess that's, we start off with how do all these things point us to Christ? All of these laws should highlight our desperate need for a high priest who isn't repulsed by our condition, but has the power to make us whole. Anybody have any thoughts or comments or questions? Don't give me any questions. I was really struggling this week. No, seriously, whatever. All right, quiet bunch tonight. what are some of the things we can pray about this evening?